Good afternoon, and this is John Bushka, and I want to talk to you a little bit about an upcoming topic that I'm going to write a big post about. The why liberalism is having so much trouble today keeping up with the trends with our polarized political climate and the trends being pulled apart by collectivism on the left, trying to see people in groups that have to be protected from speech and protected as groups, um, with by basically having the power to protect them. And on the other hand, on the right, with hierarchy and wanting things to be in a hierarchy driven by nations and families and religious values, and particularly patriarchal families, and wanting people to be fit into those. And people are running back towards authoritarianism as so I made up some notes about this. Authoritarianism views human rights as controlled by a hierarchical structure, and and if it's feudalism, religious or ethnic nationalism or fascism, or else a comradeship type of structure that still has to have somebody in charge. And it often requires people to do things according to their sex, particularly the military draft for men and women, sometimes forced to carry children that they didn't want to have to do. And that, so we're finding we're losing our freedoms, and we're sort of going back to identity politics and thinking ourselves as belonging to groups of people uh, rather than work than thinking, making our own goals for ourselves and pursuing them legally and constructively, but maybe with less deference to the opinions of others. So let me just go through a set of screens I had made back in when I wrote the book, and the Do Ask Do Tell book in 1997. And we'll talk about categories of rights as original rights, fundamental rights, to social rights, family rights, collective rights, and expressive rights. I'll just run through these and then run through the notes. An original right is one that's clearly spelled out in the Constitution or in any of the amendments. I also wanted to say right here that I don't recognize the idea of a birthright. You can't, you don't have a fundamental a right to be born to advantage, to be born into a favorable family or in a particular race or gender or at a particular time in history, or be born into a democracy when you're living in a democracy, or be born on Earth instead of another planet for that matter. We probably don't. So the idea of a birth rate is sort of off the table. So you have to sort of make it where you have to be where you are and make it as an individual. And hopefully the comments that we're making here will apply to people that trying to preserve a democracy or a liberal democracy. So examples of individual rights. That's interesting. Don't have to quarter soldiers. The third amendment, the right to bear arms, which can be limited to some extent by assault weapons, and there's a big controversy over that. What people need to protect themselves, stand your ground versus duty to retreat, willingness to accept some personal loss when you're threatened by people because of respect for life, all kinds of things. Um, Due process of the law, both procedural and substantive, access to counsel, trial by jury, writ of habeas corpus, which has been suspended, no involuntary servitude, which has to do with the draft, which has to do with men being drafted. Um, see, and life and liberty, well, whether the right to life, with abortion. I think Roe versus Wade actually had it right for about the first third. Consciousness and sentience seems to the best of our knowledge, seems to happen at about the end of the first trimester, about the end of the first trimester. So I think those were where the reasonable limits were myself. Let's just move on. Then a fundamental right is a right which may be original or be established by a long or cultural judicial tradition is essential to life, liberty, and property. The pursuit of happiness limits the power of the federal government. It may use the incorporation doctrine of the 14th Amendment or the powers of individual states. And generally, the government must pass strict scrutiny to abridge a fundamental right. And we call that notion substantive due process. Also, within the right to bear arms, there's the question of justification clause versus operational clause. When you're talking about the militia, that's a very important doctrine. I've talked about that before. So here are examples of fundamental rights. Most of them some of them were original rights, but the freedom of speech, for example, freedom of speech starts out as individual freedom to talk, to say what to talk the way you want to. Well, this doesn't, I can't seem to show my picture at the same time when I've set it up this way. But anyway, freedom of speech as an individual to say what you want around other people locally. The freedom to broadcast what you have to say online on the internet through search engines and then through algorithms and social media, either way. I started out with just search engines back in 1997. Whether that would be guaranteed by the Constitution is more questionable. And in 2007, we had a ruling on the Child Online Protection Act. Earlier, we had the Communications Decency Act issued. And states are passing laws about trying to get around COPA, trying to pass around laws around adult sites being available to children, because a lot of people who don't have children don't want to have to bother protecting children. And that's raising a constitutional question right now. It could. Freedom of the press, which is partly a collective right, because you have to be organized with other people to have a press, although you may not need very many people. So let's go on. And then the other ones are, and then we move on to other things like rights that have to do with collectively with that generally require some government support: public education, universal health care, which as in Europe and Canada, our healthcare system is privatized much more, except for Medicare. Actually, some of the European systems are more private than you think they are. Subsidies for parents, for large families, for having children, which would come at the cost of maybe single people who don't have children. That's a big issue that Vance raised. Voting, also the issue. There's a huge issue right now with of course, with eligibility to vote, particularly whether or not you have to be a citizen and how states can enforce it, because it's very difficult for most people to prove on the spot that they're citizens. They usually have to swear an oath. There's been a lot of controversy about citizenship and voting in federal, as you've been seeing in the news lately. Then I had a collective right, which was mostly, the main example was what used to be the right to bear arms, but that's become, since the Heller decision in the district, that's become a more or less an individual right since 2008, been affirmed as an individual right. But the idea of assembly and petition and even freedom of the press usually requires working with other people, not just doing things yourself. So that is somewhat of a collective right. Expressive rights, which are partly individual and partly collective. Promoting yourself online and self-publishing, and taking advantage of search engines and being found anywhere in the world, and then of algorithms and social media. Whether that would stand up to more close scrutiny in the future, protecting minors particularly, which we are hearing about from the right, and also protecting marginalized groups. There's been an issue on the left where even if you tell the truth about something, if it draws unusual attention to a marginalized group, which has been a problem with gender ideology, it might be suppressed. And that's been particularly true with the idea of hate speech laws in Europe and England. We're hearing a lot about Britain right now recently, and it's sort of out of control. You could think of property rights as expressive rights. You can do with your property what you want somewhat publicly. My father felt that way. He was very proud of the house and of his workshop and of what he did with it. That was a big deal when I was growing up, what you did with your physical property. My grandparents had farms, and they were very proud of it. That was their sort of public face to the world, was their property. And you could think of choosing a consenting adult as an intimate partner, or a significant other, as an expressive right, because that expresses your values as a person. But that can be very controversial in its effect on others. It can sort of have a strange-like effect on how others feel in a closed setting, for example. Problems with some fundamental rights. I gave some of them here, and problems with some of the expressive rights. And I'll give you this link. And then also the Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, and which would be social rights, and then his Economic Bill of Rights. That's here, and that was about 9 or 10 items, and then the Four Freedoms at the end. Yeah, which I'll give you the link to find all of these at the end. And I just wanted to bring up my notes. I made some notes just going through a few of the pages. Kinds of rights. You can think of the nuclear family, as kind of a bridge between individual and collective rights. And you can think about duties. That's what I'm going to talk about in blog posts soon, about what are the duties of the individual in protecting liberalism. What are the things individuals need to do to help reduce the polarization that's going on right now? That's going to be covered in a blog post soon, and then a future video. I have talked about this before, particularly in 2020, about the operational versus justification clauses for some rights. You could even think of that as for gratuitous speech rights, online. You could think about that in terms of operational and justification if you wanted to. It's not just the Second Amendment. Here are some other. I talked about no birthright. The freedom of speech by individuals to speak globally has become controversial because it doesn't. Whether you take responsibility for what the effect of your speech is becomes controversial. Some forms of speech are more communal, like protesting. You can speak like I do as an individual, or you can walk and take sides and walk and protest and support one side or the other, which is what the left wants you to do, and sometimes the right. You can walk and picket lines, and I never had to do that because I was in a field computer program that wasn't very unionized, so I never had to do that when I was working. The right to bear arms, that's where I talk about the justification or operational clauses. And then the identification issue for voting rights, particularly U.S. citizenship, which you're seeing stories all the time about some states like Texas, even Virginia and so forth, removing voters from the rolls. You need to follow those in the paper. The right to life is a sort of original, and I've said I think that Roe versus Wade. I think that the agreement in Roe versus Wade is probably what states ought to do, is pretty close to what they should do. Um, and then the problems panel, I talked about a few things. In the, whether you have a family or not, whether you have dependents could affect your rights. Is it wrong for me to drive a car alone without other people and burn gas? Because I just have a gas car because not being older, I'm just not prepared to deal with uh, the newer technology I probably should be, and it's more expensive. And when you're inheriting property without dependents, should you have the freedom you have that when you die, you could leave a mess for other people? Should you have to report to other people? That could become an issue for me. The idea of conservatorship or governorship or that kind of thing. I could wind up being caught by that. Another idea is, should I be responsible for being white and if I inherited property? Fortunately, I didn't run into that, but near the home that I inherited, there had been a dispute a few blocks away in the past about a property that belonged to a slave owner, and that did inhibit the development of some property for a while until it was finally litigated. Individuals speaking on their own without actually working with organizations like that is the way I speak on my own. I don't always have skin in the game when I talk about. That's an issue. Conscription, involuntary. Does that contradict the idea of no involuntary servitude? What about national service? What about the fact that a lot of young adults, the smartest young adults today, are starting businesses when they're teenagers and making real spectacles, and resume the draft or mandatory service could interfere with them. But some of the spectacular internet successes of the past few years by some younger people, you might not see as much of in the future. We've become more collective. And indeed, some of the younger adults are not keeping as high a profile as they did a few years ago, as they have to settle down and make a living. I've noticed that sexual orientation rights for men in the past ran into problems with forced intimacy, dorms, military, don't ask, don't tell, and where I was almost like a strangelet or a prion and living in the dorm at William and Mary, that other people would be influenced by my views, even though I never really did anything. Just what the possibility that I could scope them seemed to scare people when living in a dorm. That we kind of got used to that with the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military. Also, since I didn't have a family myself, I wound up with more problems with my mother as she aged. Wind up with filial responsibility for helping take care of other people if you didn't have your own children. Also, I wanted to talk about the idea that gender identity, we have gender identity and gender expression in our vocabulary right now. Gender identity as the basis for claiming rights is a member of an oppressed class. And again, I'm trying to claim rights to have and make your own choices and your own behaviors and follow your own goals without being discriminated against unreasonably. That's what I'm trying to argue for, rather than claiming that you're a member of an oppressed class, the oppressor versus oppressed. No, gender gender identity is defining people as an oppressed class, young people, young adults who have trouble meeting the norms for their apparent biological sex. Yes, they have a lot of trouble, as I did growing up. I had a lot of trouble. But gender identity, the way it's defined legally, is circular. So I don't think a court would uphold it if it ever came to that. Gender expression, maybe they would. You could say you could protect people based on their public behaviors related to gender, as long as it was not rational, as long as it was not rational to discriminate against them in housing or employment. Dress codes in the workplace and that kind of thing, though, could become an issue. Um, Normally, minors would probably not have a fundamental right to transition socially. I should have said socially here, and then because the question of puberty blockers is which the medical profession acted with bad faith on in the beginning, we really don't know that it's safe for people to do this, to never have a normal puberty. And I'll talk about that more some later. But it's not about the morality of it. It's about in itself. It's about children. Minors aren't old enough, and we can't really prove that somebody is what they claim to be, and they're not really old enough to make these decisions. And the medicalization probably will present them with lifetime problems. And yeah, I've been very much against. I have not been with the community on this. I've been criticized as phobic and everything, but I kind of with Reality's Last Stand and that crowd, Paradox Institute, and this is stuff we should not have started doing. But that's going to be another video. Biological women's spaces, they do need to protect them. And it's desirable to protect individuals with harmless and consensual adult from discrimination without forcing them to label themselves as oppressed or marginalized. I did want to just mention that also I have a booklet that's I've run out of copies of from 1998 of our fundamental rights, but I covered self-ownership, the right to life, to be free from involuntary servitude, to be left alone. That's sort of the right to privacy, the right to free speech, the right to property and controls use, to believe or not to believe in a religion, to become a parent and to vote, and then the qualifications issue and citizenship. We talked about that. I should read. I really need to redo that book. The second of my Do As Do Tell books covers similar territory, and it would propose. One of the chapters proposes a Bill of Rights too, which is a concept I worked on like in 2002, and we were talking about a lot in Minnesota when I was living there in before I came back in 2003. So this was a big day. Big topic. I'm going to be following up with some blog posts on the responsibilities of individuals soon. I'm going to say some things that will be startling. So we'll continue the discussion, and I do thank you for listening today.